It started with a sound. Not a loud one, but the kind of sharp noise that sneaks into your ears and doesn't let go. I was halfway through the door, shaking raindrops from my jacket, when I heard it. The kind of voice you never forget, my mother's, rising and falling, her words punctuated by something heavy, anger, accusation. The word betrayal floated through the air like shattered glass. I froze. My parents had always argued, sure, every family has those moments. The slight disagreements about dinner plans, which movie to watch, or whose turn it was to fix the leaky faucet. But this was different. It wasn't the soft hum of irritation I was used to. This was raw, real, and terrifying. I dropped my keys in the bowl by the door and stepped lightly into the hallway. Their bedroom door was ajar, spilling a sliver of yellow light into the otherwise dark corridor. I told myself not to look, not to get involved, but my legs betrayed me, carrying me closer. My heart pounded, drowning out the sound of the rain tapping against the windows. How long? My mother's voice broke. How long have you been lying to me? My father's reply was low, almost inaudible, but it carried weight. I couldn't catch the words, but I didn't need to. His tone equal parts exhaustion and defiance. Something irreparable had cracked between them. I leaned against the wall, trying to make sense of it. Was it money? Something at work? Another woman? My head spun with questions I wasn't ready to answer. Then, the sound of footsteps, my father's heavy stride, snapped me back to reality. I stumbled backward, my breath caught in my throat as he yanked the door open. His eyes locked on mine for a split second. They weren't angry or upset. They were hollow, like he was too tired to feel anything anymore. Without a word, he grabbed his coat from the hook by the door and walked out into the rain. The silence that followed was deafening. My mother stayed behind the half-closed door, and I stood frozen in the hallway, unsure whether to go to her or pretend I hadn't seen anything. The house felt colder, darker, like all the warmth had been sucked out with that single, unresolved moment. I decided to stay put, my back pressed against the wall. My mother appeared moments later, her face a careful mask of composure. But her red-rimmed eyes betrayed her. She tried to smile when she saw me, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sweetheart," she said softly, her voice trembling just enough for me to notice. "We'll talk about this later, okay?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. She reached out as if to touch my shoulder but stopped midway, her hand falling back to her side. Then she walked past me, heading to the kitchen. I stayed there, rooted to the spot, trying to process everything. My father was gone. My mother was upset. And whatever had just happened between them wasn't going to blow over by morning. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene over and over again in my head. The rain had softened to a gentle drizzle, the sound of droplets tapping against my window becoming a steady rhythm. But it did little to calm the storm brewing inside me. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think straight. And worst of all, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything I thought I knew about my family was about to change forever. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee brewing downstairs and the faint murmur of a radio playing in the kitchen. For a second, I thought maybe everything was fine, that the fight I'd overheard was just another fleeting argument. But the empty space in the driveway where my father's car usually sat brought reality crashing back. I walked downstairs cautiously, the tension in the air thick enough to touch. My mother was at the counter, pouring herself a cup of coffee, but she looked different. Her usual neat bun was loose, stray strands falling across her face, and her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the sugar. She didn't notice me at first, or maybe she pretended not to. "Good morning," I said hesitantly. She looked up, startled, and forced a small smile. "Morning, sweetheart. Did you sleep okay?" "Not really. The words came out sharper than I intended. I wanted to ask her what had happened, why Dad had left, but the question felt too big for the kitchen. She hesitated, as if she knew what I wanted to ask, but she didn't offer any answers. Instead, she said, "Why don't we go for a walk later by the lake? We could use some fresh air." I nodded. It was easier than arguing. The lake was only a 10-minute walk from our house, a quiet spot surrounded by tall trees and the occasional picnic table. It was one of my mother's favorite places. She said it helped her think. I wasn't sure what there was to think about now. Dad was gone. And no amount of fresh air was going to change that. We walked in silence for most of the way, the gravel crunching under our shoes. I kept waiting for her to say something, to explain, but the words didn't come until we reached the edge of the water. "I know you're upset," she began, her voice steady but soft. "And you have every right to be. Things between your father and me, they haven't been easy for a while." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. She sighed, staring out at the rippling surface of the lake. "Marriage is complicated. People change. Sometimes, no matter how much you try, you can't make things go back to the way they used to be." Her words felt rehearsed, like she'd spent all morning practicing them. But they didn't explain anything. They didn't tell me why Dad had walked out or why she looked like she hadn't slept all night. Before I could press her further, her phone buzzed. She pulled it out of her pocket, glanced at the screen, and immediately declined the call. I caught a glimpse of the name before she slid it back into her jacket, unknown. "It's nothing," she said quickly, noticing my expression. But her hands were shaking again. By the time we got home, the air between us felt heavier than before. I went to my room, desperate for space, but the unease wouldn't leave me. I kept thinking about her phone, about the way she'd brushed off that call. Something didn't add up. That evening, I stepped outside to clear my head. The backyard was quiet, the kind of peaceful that made it hard to believe anything was wrong. I walked toward the garden, letting the cool air calm my nerves, when I saw her. My mother was standing near the gate, talking to someone. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark coat. His back was to me, but I could hear the low rumble of his voice, though I couldn't make out the words. My mother looked tense, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. I moved closer, staying hidden behind the corner of the house. Their conversation grew more animated. He said something that made her shake her head, and then he reached out his hand, brushing hers. She didn't pull away, and then it happened. He leaned in his lips, barely brushing hers at first, as if testing the waters for a moment. She hesitated, but then she kissed him back. It wasn't long, barely a second, but it was enough to make my stomach twist into knots. I must have made a sound, a gasp, a step back, because she turned suddenly, her eyes locking onto mine, her face drained of color. "Wait," she called out, but I was already walking away, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I was inside. The door slammed shut behind me. She came to my room an hour later, knocking softly before letting herself in. I was sitting on the bed, arms wrapped around my knees, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I looked up at her, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "Then what is it? Because it sure looked like you were kissing some random guy while Dad's. I don't even know where he is." She flinched, but she didn't deny it. Instead, she sat down next to me, leaving a careful distance between us. "I made a mistake," she said finally. "A big one. And I'll explain everything, I promise. But you have to trust me." "How am I supposed to trust you after that?" My voice cracked. and I hated how small I sounded. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached out, as if to touch my hand, but thought better of it. Just give me some time. Please. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. All I knew was that everything felt wrong and I wasn't sure how to fix it. The room was silent as she left, closing the door softly behind her. But her words stayed with me, looping in my mind like a broken record. Give me some time. I wasn't sure I had any left to give. The morning after the scene in the backyard, I woke up feeling like I'd spent the entire night running. My body was heavy, and my mind wouldn't stop replaying what I'd seen. My mother kissing that man wasn't something I could explain away, no matter how much I wanted to. And then there was Dad, gone without a word, leaving behind a silence that seemed to press against my chest. Downstairs, the house was eerily quiet. My mother was sitting at the dining table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had probably gone cold. She glanced up when I walked in, her eyes searching mine for something, understanding, maybe, or forgiveness. "Good morning," she said, her voice fragile. I ignored her, grabbing a piece of toast from the counter. The tension between us was suffocating, but I wasn't ready to talk about what I'd seen. Not yet. I thought maybe we could go out for breakfast. She ventured after a long pause. Just us. There's this new cafe on. I'm busy. I cut her off, my voice sharper than I intended. I wasn't busy, not really. I just couldn't sit across from her and pretend everything was fine. Her face fell, but she didn't push. Instead, she nodded, her fingers tightening around her mug. "Okay," she said quietly. Later that afternoon, I decided I needed answers. Sitting around the house wasn't getting me anywhere, and my mom clearly wasn't going to tell me the truth, so I did the only thing I could think of. I texted Dad. "Where are you? Can we talk?" The 3 dots appeared almost immediately, then disappeared again. I stared at the screen, willing him to reply, until finally the message came through. "I'm fine. Let's talk soon." It wasn't much, but it was enough to set me on edge. Fine wasn't an answer, and soon didn't tell me anything. Frustrated, I threw my phone onto the bed and paced the room, trying to figure out what to do next. That's when I remembered the man. The one from the backyard. Whoever he was, he had answers. And if my mother wasn't going to give them to me, maybe he would. The next day, I followed her. It wasn't hard. She left the house around lunchtime, dressed in her usual jeans and jacket, and headed into town. I kept a safe distance, staying far enough back that she wouldn't notice me. My heart pounded as I trailed her down the main street, past the rows of coffee shops and boutiques. Finally, she stopped at a small cafe on the corner, one with big windows and tables spilling out onto the sidewalk. And there he was. He was already sitting at a table near the back, his hands resting casually on the edge of the table. My mother walked in, greeted him with a nod, and sat down across from him. They started talking immediately, their heads close together. I slipped inside, pretending to browse the pastry counter, and found a seat near enough to overhear bits of their conversation. It wasn't easy. The cafe was busy, and their voices were low, but I caught enough to make my stomach twist. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up," my mother said. She sounded tired, defeated. "You're doing the right thing," the man replied. His voice was calm, reassuring, like he was used to diffusing situations like this. "It's better this way. For everyone. For everyone," she repeated, her voice rising slightly. "You don't know what it's like, keeping secrets from your own child." At that, I froze. They were talking about me. The man leaned forward, lowering his voice even more. I strained to hear, but all I caught was, "if she finds out." By the time they left the cafe, I was burning with questions. What were they hiding from me? And why was this stranger so involved in my family's problems? I waited until my mother had driven off before approaching him. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He turned, his expression flickering with surprise. "Can I help you?" I hesitated, suddenly unsure of what to say. But then I thought of my father, my mother's lies, and all the things they weren't telling me. "I need to know who you are." For a moment he looked like he might walk away. But then he sighed and gestured toward a nearby bench. "Let's sit." I followed him, my heart pounding in my ears. He didn't speak right away, instead watching the cars pass on the street, as if trying to decide how much to tell me. "My name is David," he said finally. "I'm a friend of your mother's friend," I repeated, my voice laced with disbelief. "Is that what you call sneaking around behind her family's back?" He winced but didn't deny it. "It's not what you think," he said. "I'm trying to help her. Your parents are going through a difficult time and I'm just offering support." "Support," I said flatly. "By meeting her in secret, Anne." I couldn't bring myself to finish the sentence. The image of their kiss was still too fresh in my mind. "It's complicated," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "Your mother is struggling, and so is your father. But they both care about you. That hasn't changed." His words did little to ease my frustration. If anything, they only raised more questions. What kind of support did my mother need that she couldn't get from her own family? And why did it feel like I was the last person to know what was really going on? When I got home, my mother was waiting for me. She was sitting on the couch, her hands folded in her lap, and she looked up as soon as I walked in. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice tight. "I could ask you the same thing," I shot back. Her expression faltered, but she didn't say anything. I dropped my bag onto the floor and crossed my arms, determined to hold my ground. "I talked to him," I said finally. "David, or whoever he is." Her eyes widened, and for a moment she looked genuinely scared. But then she took a deep breath, her shoulders straightening. "We need to talk," she said. "Yeah," I replied, my voice cold. "We do." The silence that followed was deafening. But this time, I wasn't backing down. The tension in the house had grown unbearable by the time my mother finally decided to break the silence. She knocked on my bedroom door one evening, her voice soft but insistent. "Can I come in?" I hesitated, then opened the door a crack. She stood there holding a program, her name and my father's printed prominently on the cover. I knew what it was before she even said the words. "I want you to come to our show tonight," she said. Her tone was careful, as if she was testing the waters. "Your father and I were performing together again." That caught me off guard. I hadn't seen them perform in years. Acting had always been their shared passion, their way of communicating when words failed. But lately it felt like they couldn't even stand to be in the same room. The idea of them on stage together seemed almost impossible. I folded my arms, unsure why now. She gave me a small, tired smile. "Because it's important. To me, to your father, to us as a family. We want you there." There was something in her voice, hope maybe. Either way, I couldn't say no. Deep down, I wanted to believe that this could be a step toward fixing whatever was broken. That evening, the theater buzzed with energy as I found my seat near the front. The space was familiar, yet it felt different somehow. like it had grown smaller since the last time I'd been there. The house lights dimmed and a hush fell over the audience as the curtain rose. My mother and father stepped onto the stage together, and for a moment, it was like the past few weeks hadn't happened. They looked poised and confident, their movements synchronized in a way that spoke of years of practice and trust. They were performing a classic drama about love and loss, their chemistry electric, drawing the audience into their world. As I watched, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time: pride. They weren't just my parents, they were artists, capable of transforming pain into something beautiful. Their voices filled the theater, rich with emotion, and I couldn't help but get swept up in the story they were telling. There was a scene halfway through the play where my father's character reached for my mother's hand, and she hesitated before taking it. It was subtle, but the tension was palpable. It mirrored something real, something raw, and I couldn't tell where the performance ended and the truth began. The applause at the end of the scene was thunderous. After the show, I waited for them in the lobby, surrounded by the chatter of other audience members. My mother was the first to spot me, her face lighting up as she walked over. "Well," she asked, her voice tinged with nervous excitement, "what did you think?" "It was amazing," I admitted, and I meant it. "You were both amazing." My father joined us then, his expression guarded but not unfriendly. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice gruff but sincere. For the first time in weeks, we stood together without the weight of unspoken words hanging over us. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. That night, back at home, my mother knocked on my door again. This time, when she entered, she didn't look nervous, just determined. "I want to explain everything," she said, sitting on the edge of my bed. "About David, about your father, about all of it." I braced myself, my heart pounding. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. She took a deep breath before she began. "Your father and I have been struggling for a long time. We thought that working together again might help us reconnect. But it's not that simple." "What about David?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "What does he have to do with any of this?" Her expression softened and she looked almost ashamed. "David is a friend. He's been helping me through some of the things I haven't been able to talk about with your father. It wasn't supposed to be anything more, but I made a mistake." "Mistake?" I repeated, my chest tightening. "Is that what you call kissing him?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't look away. "I'm not proud of it, and I didn't mean for you to see that. But it made me realize how much I still care about your father. How much I want to fix things." Her honesty took me by surprise. I didn't know whether to believe her, but there was something in her voice that made me want to try. The next morning, my father pulled me aside before I left for class. "I heard your mother talk to you last night," he said, his tone measured. "I just want you to know, we're both trying. For you, and for us." I nodded, not trusting myself to say much. There was still so much I didn't understand, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a tiny sliver of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could get better. The days following the performance felt lighter somehow. My parents were still navigating their way through the murky waters of their relationship, but something had shifted. They seemed more willing to talk, more willing to try. And I was cautiously hopeful, though I kept my distance, unsure how much I could let myself believe in the fragile truce between us. And one evening, as I was getting ready to head out for a study session at the library, my mother called me into the living room. She was holding a small, worn envelope, her expression unreadable. "This came for you," she said, handing it over. I opened it carefully, my heart racing for reasons I couldn't explain. Inside was a single piece of paper with a familiar handwriting. My father's. Meet me at the theater. Midnight. No explanation, no context. Just those 6 words. I looked up at my mother, but she just smiled faintly. You should go. The theater was dark and empty when I arrived, the faint hum of the city outside muffled by the heavy wooden doors. I stepped inside cautiously, the echo of my footsteps making the vast space feel even larger. The stage was lit dimly, a single spotlight casting a soft glow over its center. Dad. I called out, my voice trembling slightly. He stepped out from the shadows, looking more at ease than I'd seen him in months. He was holding a folded piece of paper, and when he spoke, his voice was steady. I wrote something, he said. Dad. It's a scene for us. I stared at him, confused. For us. He nodded. I thought maybe we could perform it. Just once. Together. I hesitated. Acting had never been my thing. It was their world, not mine. But the look in his eyes was one I couldn't refuse. The script was simple, a short dialogue between a father and daughter trying to understand each other. As we went through the lines, something shifted. The words weren't just words, they were ours. Each line we spoke felt like a piece of the wall between us crumbling away. By the time we reached the final line, I wasn't sure if I was still acting or just saying what I'd wanted to say for weeks. I just want us to be okay, I whispered, my voice breaking. So do I, he replied, his tone soft but certain. For a moment, the theater was silent, the weight of the scene settling over us like a blanket. Then, slowly, he stepped forward and pulled me into a hug. It was the kind of hug that didn't need words, the kind that said everything. When we left the theater that night, the air felt different, lighter, like the storm that had been hanging over us for so long had finally begun to clear. My mother was waiting for us outside, her expression unreadable, until she saw the look on my father's face. Then she smiled, the kind of smile that made me believe, just for a moment, that we might actually be okay. And as we walked home together, side by side, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, hope.